Lord, thanks for gathering us once again this morning and giving us the great privilege of being able to think carefully about your word. We pray, Lord, that you would guide us in our thinking about this. And Lord, I pray that as a result of the time we spend together, we wouldn't just know more, but that we would love you more deeply and we would be motivated and empowered to serve you more effectively. And so we commit ourselves to you during this time and ask that you would glorify yourself in and through each one of us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we're going to continue our discussion of Deuteronomy's vision in the Christian church coming out of the wilderness. If you were here last week, you may recall that we talked about how Deuteronomy in some ways is uniquely appropriate and uniquely applicable for us in our situation, in that it's addressing the situation of people who were seeking to live faithfully as the people of God in the midst of changed circumstances and in the midst of an environment where the people around them are not supportive of them. They're not happy to see them. They're not glad to welcome them into their midst. And I suggested that there were lots of parallels to that. And so last week we talked about the first aspect of Deuteronomy's vision being the supremacy of Yahweh. The idea that we can only succeed at being the people of God if we acknowledge God's supremacy, that he is utterly unique, that he is to be worshiped and honored, not just in word, but in every aspect of life. And so we're going to build on that this week as we look at the next aspect of Deuteronomy's vision. And I want to just note that the remaining three, after the first one, there's going to be four aspects of this vision we're going to talk about. They all build on this idea of the supremacy of Yahweh. And as I said last week, if the Israelites didn't get this right, the idea of the supremacy of Yahweh, it's game over. They might as well go home and give up, because they won't succeed if they don't get that right. So this week we're going to talk about the religious significance of all of life. And you notice that I have religious in quotes there. That is intentional, and I'm doing that because sometimes in our circles we have a tendency to draw a contrast between religious and spiritual. You know, we talk about spiritual life, and religion is sometimes a bad word in our circles. That's not how I'm using it here. I'm talking about the difference between religious and secular. The idea of the sphere of God and something that is envisioned without God being in our midst. So the religious significance of all of life is the next aspect of Deuteronomy's vision. As you read through Deuteronomy, you'll note that the first 11 chapters tell a story. It tells the story in some respects of the Israelites gathered on the plains of Moab, the back door to the promised land, as I said last week. And Moses kind of reminding them of some of the things that he had talked to them. And then in chapters 12 through 26, you have the legal material in Deuteronomy. And this is the part that's sometimes challenging for us to read, because it's a recitation of a number of laws and instructions that are a repeat to some extent, or a recontextualization. Moses is preaching, and he's trying to help this next generation understand the significance of these instructions. But he gives them all these instructions in chapters 12 through 26. And we sometimes don't know what to do with that. You know, as followers of Jesus, the question is that still something we need to care about? Or is it something that we can more or less ignore? And I think, and I want to suggest this morning, that ignoring these instructions is a mistake. Because God has given to his people these instructions of how they are supposed to live, how they're supposed to live at being the people of God. And so we can pay attention to that. The problem is we don't always know what to do with it. So I want to give a quick overview of, in some respects, how we might think about the the instructions that we find in the book of Deuteronomy in the legal section. Now, a traditional approach to this question is to take the laws of the Old Testament, including the laws in Deuteronomy, and to divide them into three categories. To say that you have civil laws, you have ceremonial laws, and you have moral laws. And then in this approach, typically what happens is people will say, well, Jesus fulfilled the civil and the ceremonial laws. We don't have to worry about those, and we're only concerned about the moral laws. How many of you have heard that kind of approach? Are you familiar with that? Anybody heard that? Some of you are kind of nodding your heads, so you might have heard that. The problem with this approach is that these categories in terms of civil, ceremonial, and moral laws, first of all, they're nowhere found in the text. Okay? There's no hint that Moses or original readers divided the laws in these ways and saw them this way. Now, in itself, that's not an insurmountable obstacle, because after all, we know that the word Trinity doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible, and yet we rightly believe that that's how God has always existed. But we can point to instances where the three persons of the Trinity are being introduced or being referred to, and derive our understanding of the Trinity from that. You can't really do that with the civil, ceremonial, and moral law approach. If we take as an example, I don't have a slide for this, but Leviticus chapter 19. And if you have a Bible and you want to flip to that, you can go ahead and do that. But in Leviticus chapter 19, we have an example of some laws being put together that we might not think belong together. So if we start in verse 18, so Leviticus chapter 19 and then verse 18. You must not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the children of your people, but you must love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. You must keep my statutes. You must not allow two different kinds of your animals to breed. You must not sow your field with two different kinds of seed, and you must not wear a garment made of two different kinds of fabric. So here we have, in one passage, an example of at least two different kinds of laws. Civil laws are ones that govern the public life of the nation. Ceremonial laws are things like sacrifice and what we just heard about wearing clothing made of two types of fabric. And then moral laws are those timeless truths about God's intentions for human behavior. But in Leviticus 19, in the passage that I just read, we have, first of all, where it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? And this is what the commandment that Jesus cites as the second greatest commandment. So that's an example in this traditional approach of a moral law that would be considered relevant for today. But then in the very next verse, you have the command to not wear clothing made of two types of fabric, which is an example of a ceremonial law. And the thing that binds those two things together, what bridges those two things together, it says, you must keep all my commands. So there's nothing in the passage that would suggest that Moses saw, well, this is moral law, this is ceremonial law, this is civil law, so we don't have to worry about those things, or eventually we're not going to have to worry about those things. And so the problem is that it's very difficult to draw distinctions. These categories aren't in the text, and it's challenging to know where one begins and the other ends. For example, with the idea of not wearing clothing made of two types of fabric, the purpose of that law is to serve as an object lesson, an illustration for the Israelites of who they are. That is, it's not about clothing, it's about people. And the Israelites needed to be distinct from the nations. They needed to live differently, they needed to eat differently, they needed to dress differently from the nations so that they can stay pure or distinct from them. And the word set apart, as I can't remember if we talked about this last week, but that's the word holy. That's what the word holy means, is to be set apart. And so this is the idea of not wearing clothing made of two types of fabric isn't because God doesn't like polycotton blends or anything like that. It's because the people need to dress differently. That by not mixing two types of fabric, it's saying it's reminding them that we're not going to mix two types of people. That is, followers of Yahweh and non-followers of Yahweh, Israelites and Gentiles. Now, the reason why I'm noting that is because when you understand that the purpose of that law, to not wear clothing made of two types of fabric, is actually about mission, the identity of Israel as the people of God, and the call to be a witness to the nations and that sort of thing, it's a lot harder to say, well, that's just ceremonial. There's a moral component to that, right? There's a missional component to that. Certainly the idea that that God cares about all humanity and Israel is supposed to be set apart to be a witness to them is bigger than just simply about what clothes they're going to wear or what food they're going to eat. So because of these challenges, a lot of Old Testament scholars, myself included, have begun to look at different ways of approaching the law. And I want to suggest that a better way to approach this might be what we could call a paradigmatic approach to the law. To understand the law gives us an example. The law gives examples of how to live as the people of God. And those examples need to then be applied in any circumstance in which the people find themselves. Now, to understand this, let me get a few things for us to make sure that we're oriented in terms of what we're talking about here. When we talk about Torah, and I'm going to use the word Torah primarily to talk about the laws or the instructions that you find, although it does refer to the first 5 books of the Bible as well. What we call the Pentateuch is in Hebrew the Torah. And we usually translate the word Torah as law, although I think that's not the best translation. But the Hebrew word Torah is broader than the English word law that we usually use to translate this particular word. So help me think for just a second about the English word law. What comes to mind when you think of the English word law? What kinds of things jump to your mind? Say again? Rules. Right, rules. What else? Boundaries? Yeah, boundaries. Rules and boundaries. What else? Say one more time. Strict. Okay. What do we call someone who breaks the law?
Criminal.
A criminal, right? A lawbreaker. And who makes the laws that we abide by in our society? The government, right?
Yeah.
You can be taken to jail for breaking the law. You can pay penalties for breaking the law. There are consequences. There are punishments for that. Now, let me ask you a question. Can we be not guilty of breaking the law? That is, we're not lawbreakers, but also unrighteous in our society. When you think not from a biblical perspective, but or to put it more directly, can we not be a lawbreaker but still be a jerk?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Of course you can. Now here's an example, because our law doesn't have much to do with the idea of righteousness, right? That's not a term that you find in the law, in our secular law. Here's an example. I could go to a CPR class, and let's say I go to the CPR class, and I am the top graduate of this CPR class. I spend a whole day or however long it is on CPR, and I'm the best administrator of CPR in the class. Okay, and I walk out of the class with my certificate in hand that says I am certified in CPR, and I'm the best in my class, and I can walk out of the parking lot, and somebody right in front of me has a heart attack, and they fall on the ground, okay? I can save them because of my CPR skills. Now, because I'm not a medical doctor or any kind of medical professional, I could step over that person, walk to my car, and drive home and do nothing, and they die as a result of that. The law cannot do anything to me in that situation because I'm not a medical doctor. That's the law in all 50 states. I don't have, and I can do that for any reason. I can do it because I'm bored. I can do it because I'm lazy. I can do it because I'm racist, I'm sexist, I'm whatever, any reason whatsoever, and the law can't do anything to me. Now, I haven't broken a law in that, but am I a good person if I do that? No, I'm a terrible person if I do that. But the law in our secular society is not about righteousness. It's about restraint. It's about boundaries, all these kinds of things. So what we need to understand is that in Hebrew and in the Old Testament, the idea of law is broader than our conception of it. In fact, what it refers to is the divine standard of conduct for the people of God. What the Torah gives, what the instructions of the Old Testament give, is a way of living. A way of living as the people of God. It's the divine standard of conduct. So you find everything from, you shall have no other gods before me, to don't wear clothing made of two types of fabric. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. What does that mean? And these kinds of things that you find in the law. It covers the whole of standard conduct for the people of God, how they're supposed to live. What we need to also understand is it includes all of the Pentateuch, not just the legal material. Now, I've been talking about the legal material in chapters 12 through 26 of Deuteronomy, but of course there's legal material in Exodus and Leviticus especially, and Numbers as well. But the book of Genesis is part of the Pentateuch. Is that part of the instruction that God gives, the divine standard of conduct? Well, it is, because there's a couple of ways that you can instruct people. One is you can tell them what to do, right? You just say, thou shalt do this, or thou shalt not do that. That's one way of giving instruction. Another way is to show them and to give examples. So you have in, for example, the creation account, where it talks about the creation of Adam and Eve and the establishment of marriage as the fundamental building block for human society. And obviously there is only Adam and Eve at that point, but the implication, the two become one flesh. And that's clear there. And so the standard that's being shown is one man, one woman for life. Okay? Later that's legislated. Later that's made explicit. But it's shown in this. And then you have a story like the story of Jacob. And Jacob, if you remember, he has two wives. And he's got Rachel and Leah. And it says that he loves Rachel and he hates Leah. He was tricked into marrying Leah. He married her first. And so he was tricked into marrying her. He loves Rachel and he hates Leah. So what that passage does is it shows us the problem when people don't abide by God's commands to limit marriage to one man, one woman for life. Okay, now we don't have to get into the fact that Jacob was tricked and that sort of thing. The point is, we have perhaps history's first recorded dysfunctional family in Jacob's life because of the fact that he's not following God's command. So that's an example of showing. And we have both showing and telling that communicates this divine standard of conduct. Now the next thing we need to understand is that Torah, these instructions, the laws that God gives, are given after the election and the deliverance from Egypt, the election of Israel, the choice of Israel. Now why does that matter? I think a big problem that many of us have when it comes to the legal material of the Old Testament is because we have a misconception about it. we think that the law is given to the Israelites in order to tell them how they can earn relationship with God. It's like a scorecard, and they keep score, and how they do on this determines whether they're being the people of God, whether they can be the people of God, and if they're 50.0001% righteous, or keeping it 50.001% more than they're not keeping it, they're good. That is not a biblical conception. Okay, that's not what the Bible teaches, because the Torah, these instructions that the people are given after God has already chosen them to be his people. God chose the Israelites in Genesis chapter 12 when he says to Abram, go from your country and your family and your father's house to a land I'm going to show you. And so he chooses Abraham, then and the descendants, then Isaac, and then Jacob, as the people, to be the people of God. They're already the people of God. In fact, in the book of Exodus, where we get the beginning of the legal material being given to the people, God in the early chapters says, I have heard the cries of my people Israel. And he talks about, I'm going to redeem my people, bring out my people. Moses, speaking on behalf of God, says to Pharaoh, let my people go. So the Israelites are already the people of God. They're not earning their status as people of God. The law in the Old Testament was never about earning relationship with God. And we can also see this, we don't have time to look at passages, but when you look at how the people receive the law, at no point is it like, oh, shoot, we got to do all this? There's 613 commands in the law. There's, we think of the 10 Commandments, those are the big ones, but there's 613 commands, and it's not like the people ever reply and say, oh, that's too many. 600 is my max. That's all I'm going to do and negotiate this. It's not like that. They receive it with gratitude. If you want some homework to check me on this, read Psalm 119. It's the longest psalm in the Bible, but it's what's known as a Torah psalm. And so the Psalm 119 is talking about the goodness of the law. And so we all know, presumably, that Amy Grant song, Thy Word, and it talks about, it's from Psalm 119. But the Torah psalm is focusing more on your law is a light unto my feet, or a lamp on my path, whatever it is. I messed that up. But in any event, it's a celebration of law. And in fact, in Psalm 119, you'll find that it talks about, the psalmist says, I delight in your law because of it, I can walk around in freedom. And we don't usually think of law and freedom, but the psalmist does. And that's how the psalmist in Psalm 119 replies to the law and says, this is the greatest gift that we've been given, because it tells the people what they need to know in order to succeed at being the people of God. And so we need to understand this as we approach this legal material in Deuteronomy chapters 12 through 26. Because what's happening is Moses is telling the people that all of life matters to God. Okay? That's the crucial takeaway of this second aspect of the vision of Deuteronomy, that all of life matters to God. That every moment of every day is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to show loyalty to God, or it's an opportunity to show disloyalty to God. There is no neutral ground from an Israelite perspective, from an Old Testament perspective. There is no neutral ground. There's no part of life that God is uninterested in. There's no part of life that God is uninvolved in. And every moment of every day is that opportunity to show loyalty to God or to show disloyalty to God. And they understood that this is not about earning relationship with God. It's not a scorecard kind of a thing. It's how do you live as the people of God? How do you bring this in? So this is why you have things like as I mentioned, the food laws, right? It's not that God wants to deprive the Israelites of delicious food, and it's not that the food is unhygienic. You know about the kosher food laws and the prohibitions on certain things. The food laws are actually about people. They're not about food. And the reason we know this is because you can divide all of humanity into one of three categories. You've got priests, you have Israelites, and you have Gentiles. Now, they're not the same size, groups of people, obviously, but all humanity fits into one of those three categories. You've got priests, you have Israelites, and you have Gentiles. And those categories correspond exactly to the classes of animals. You have sacrificial animals, you have clean animals, and you have unclean animals. And the scale, what causes when we divide humanity into three categories, it's not going from good to bad, from priests to Israelites to Gentiles. Because remember, God is the creator of all. He's the creator of all human beings. And so he cares for all human beings. The difference there is how they access God. That's what separates priests and Israelites and Gentiles. But remember what I said before about those object lessons, the need for the people to remember who they are. The Israelites have to remember that they're Israelites. They have to remember that they're different from the Gentiles and that they exist to be a witness to the Gentiles of what it means to be human in relationship with God. So the food laws, which correspond to those categories, where you have the sacrificial animals that are eaten by the priests, the clean animals that are eaten by the Israelites, and the unclean animals that can be eaten by the Gentiles, those also aren't good to bad or healthy to unhealthy. It's simply about creating that object lesson for the Israelites so that they eat as Israelites. That when they sit down to eat, they eat as Israelites. Because every moment, as I said, of every day is an opportunity to show loyalty to God or disloyalty to God. So they have to eat as Israelites, and that means avoiding certain things, not because they're bad for the people, but simply because God decides to want to set them apart. Now we know that the food laws are about people, not food, when we think about Acts 10. And so if you got your Bible, let's flip to Acts chapter 10 and take a quick look at this vision. This is perhaps familiar to you. This is the story of when Peter is he's going to go and visit a guy named Cornelius. And so in Acts chapter 10, it talks about, in verse 9, about noon the next day, while they were on their way and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted to eat. But while they were preparing the meal, a trance came over him. He saw heaven opened and an object, something like a large sheet descending, being let down to earth by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed animals and reptiles of the earth and wild birds. Then a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, slaughter and eat." But Peter said, "Certainly not, Lord, for I have never eaten anything defiled and ritually unclean." The voice spoke to him again a second time. "What God has made clean, you must not consider ritually unclean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the object was taken up into heaven. So here we have a story of Peter, who is an observant Jew. He knows the Old Testament Torah. He knows the law, the instructions. And he has this vision of a sheep. He's being told to get up and kill and eat these animals, unclean animals. And God says to him in the vision, "Don't call something unclean that I have declared clean." Now, what happens next in the story? If you look in your passage, what happens next is not that the servant preparing the meal comes in with some bacon-wrapped scallops and says, "Here, Peter, here's a special treat that you haven't been able to eat before. Now you can," right? What happens next? Gentiles come, and they want Peter to instruct them. And what does Peter do? Because he had this vision of all these animals, he says, "Okay, I'll go with you." He wouldn't have gone with them before, but he has this vision. So the food laws are not about food. They're about people. And so what they do is they serve to provide that object lesson, an example to the people of what it means, just as a reminder to them of the fact that they are Israelites, that they are separate. Now, the reason why the food can be declared clean is not because there's, from Moses' day to Jesus' day, some huge advance in food preservation technology or something like that would allow for whatever kinds of food to be considered, if they were considered unhygienic then, to be considered hygienic in Jesus' day. The difference is that Jesus eliminates the distinction between Jew and Gentile, at least in the sense of how people need to live. He says that if you want to be part of the community of the people of God, you have to identify with me, whether you're Jewish or whether you're Gentile. Because prior to that point, people needed to become functionally Israelite. If they wanted to become a part of the people of God, they had to imitate what the Israelites did. But Jesus comes and says, anybody who wants to be a part of the people of God have to identify with me. And so that eliminates the distinction between Jew and Gentile. And so you no longer need that object lesson. And so he can declare all foods clean in that way. So when we approach the legal material in Deuteronomy and ask the question about how is this relevant for us and what does this vision have to say, it's highlighting, as I said, the religious significance of all of life. All of life matters to God from Deuteronomy's perspective. And I want to give you an example from Deuteronomy. I know we've been doing a lot of laying the groundwork from other places. I'm going to give you an example from Deuteronomy in a minute, but I wanted to give you a chance to ask questions, because I know we're coming fast and furious on this. It's like maybe drinking water from a fire hose, and I get that. But I want to make sure that if you have questions about what I'm saying about this understanding of law, that you have a chance to ask them, because this could be a new perspective for some of you, and I recognize that. Are there any questions on that before we look at an example from Deuteronomy? Yes?
Yeah. What do you mean by, like, two sets of clothing?
So the law says not to wear clothing made of two types of fabric. And so they're saying don't sew together if they've woven something from a cotton or done something like that along with wool, to not make clothing of that. And the point of that is to be a reminder to the Israelites that they are supposed to be different from the Gentiles, from the nations around them.
Yeah.
Other questions? Okay. Then let's take a look at an example. Oops. Okay. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 15 and 16. It says, "However, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns as much as you desire, according to the blessing of Yahweh your God that he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it as of the gazelle and as of the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You shall pour it out on the earth like water." Now remember what I said last week about the setting of Deuteronomy. This is given to the second generation of Israelites that are on the verge of the promised land. The first generation has died out, and now the second generation is at what I call the back door to the promised land, and they're receiving instructions from Moses as to what they need to know in order to be the people of God when they go into the land, and there's these changed circumstances. And remember last week I had that diagram of the camp. Do you remember that? And the tabernacle was in the very center of the camp. So when Israelites, when they're in the wilderness, wanted to eat any meat, and we know that they had things for sacrifice and that sort of thing, they had to go to the tabernacle in order to do that, because all slaughter of animals was taking place at the tabernacle while they were in the wilderness. But of course, when they go into the land of Canaan, it's about the size of New Jersey, so it doesn't work very well to say all your slaughter is going to take place at the central sanctuary. It could be a great distance for some people to go there. And so what happens in Deuteronomy in chapter 12 is it says there's one place of sacrifice. Okay? They're not supposed to have an altar in every town. They're not supposed to. There's one place of sacrifice. And that's where they bring their sacrifices 3 times a year. They could go more frequently than that, but they need to go at least 3 times a year in order to offer their sacrifices. But then it says, however, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns as much as you desire, according to the blessing of Yahweh your God that He has given you. And so what usually happens, this is understood as describing profane slaughter. In other words, secular slaughter of animals. Non-religious slaughter of animals is another way we could talk about this. The heading of my Bible that I was reading from says, Regulations Concerning Profane Slaughter. So this is a typical view of understanding that. But it's not the best way to understand that, because in verse 15, where it says you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns, the Hebrew word that's used here is not JPZ. There's supposed to be a Hebrew font there, and on my computer it has Hebrew. But it's the Hebrew word zavach. And you don't need to worry about how to spell that. But the Hebrew word zavach, which means sacrifice. Now, there are some who would say, well, this is describing slaughter of animals that is not sacrifice. It's obviously not sacrifice because it says the clean and the unclean can eat of it. But there's a perfectly good Hebrew word that means exactly what they're describing. That is slaughter that's in a non-religious context. And that word isn't used here. It's used elsewhere in Deuteronomy, but it's not used here. Instead, the word sacrifice is used, which clearly is religious in nature. And yet it's also clearly not sacrifice, because the clean and the unclean can eat of it. So what's going on? What's going on with this? Well, what I would suggest is that what Deuteronomy is doing, what Moses is instructing the people to do, is to, in their daily lives, maybe they're 100 miles away from the central sanctuary, and they only get there 3 times a year to offer their sacrifices. But in their daily lives, they are called to imitate what takes place at the sanctuary when they actually perform sacrifice. In other words, they're not to see the slaughter of an animal as religiously insignificant. So I actually argue that this is not profane slaughter at all. It's not sacrifice. It's non-sacrificial slaughter, but it is still religiously significant. They're to imitate what's being done in sacrifice, and they're to do that whenever they kill an animal for food. Now, one of the ways we know this is not just the use of the word zavach, sacrifice, in this, which is, as I've noted, is a strange place to use that word, since it's clearly not sacrifice and it's not at the central sanctuary. But the other thing is the manipulation of blood. Because, as we note, it says in verse 16, only you shall not eat the blood, you shall pour it out on the earth like water. Now, in the regulations concerning sacrifice, what takes place at the central sanctuary in the actual sacrifice is blood manipulation. They catch some of the blood and they pour it on the altar. That's part of the worship that takes place with sacrifice. And here, in this this sacrifice that takes place outside the non-sacrificial slaughter, they're being told to manipulate the blood, to take the blood and to pour it out on the earth like water. And so what I think is happening here is that Moses is giving this instruction that says, when you're going to kill an animal for food, of course you can eat that animal for food. God's not saying, only eat meat 3 times a year, or have to go up to the central sanctuary anytime you want to kill an animal for food. But when you kill an animal for food, you do it in a religiously significant way. You do it in a way that imitates what's happening at the sanctuary. So you have your animal, you kill it, you then manipulate the blood, you pour it out on the earth. And in that way, they're to be reminded of the fact that they slaughter animals as Israelites. They slaughter animals as the people of God. No other nation in the ancient Near East did this, as far as we know. There's no commands for them to do anything like this, to manipulate the blood, to imitate what is being done at in a worship setting. So what's happening is that worship is being centralized. Worship is being kept in one place. Sacrifice is being kept in one place, according to Deuteronomy chapter 12. But worship is being spread out throughout the land, so that whenever the Israelites are killing an animal, they're worshiping. They're not sacrificing, but they're worshiping. And so what this does is this highlights the religious significance of all of life. Even something as mundane as slaughtering an animal for food is religiously significant. It's to be done in a way that shows that they are Israelites. It acknowledges that they worship a different kind of God because of who Yahweh is. Okay, questions on that? How are we doing for time? Okay. No questions on that? Come on, it couldn't have been that clear. Okay, so let's think a little bit more about the religious significance of all of life. I want you to, this isn't a Bible quiz or anything like that, but I want to just think together here for a minute about what we can recall from the law, and you might remember only one or two things from it, but let's just think about the various laws that you remember, and think about how that fits into the whole of the life of the people. So let's just start. Somebody tell me a law that you remember from the Torah, from the Old Testament.
Dealing with mold.
Say again?
Dealing with mold.
Dealing with mold. Okay. That's an interesting one to remember. Okay, so even something as simple as how you clean your house, how you get rid of mold matters to God, right? And so they have this process of this, of how to deal with mold in the home. So that when an Israelite, when they do their spring cleaning, it's not just a matter of, well, I'm just cleaning my house. They're cleaning their house as Israelites. They're doing that in a way that will indicate that. And the problem with mold is that it spreads, right? And so you have to eradicate that. So it's an object lesson for them as well about things like sin and how things take root and spreads in there. So this is an object lesson. What else? Another law.
Regulations for infectious skin disease.
Infectious skin diseases, same sort of thing. There's laws about this. How do you treat these things? And someone is considered unclean, they have to go outside of the community. That too is an object lesson, because it's a reminder that the community of the people of God is to be kept pure, is to be kept holy, and set apart. Remember that God is in the midst of the Israelites. You've got when in Deuteronomy, well, elsewhere in the Pentateuch as well, but in Deuteronomy it's very explicit. You got at the center of the camp as they move, or in the center of the camp is the tabernacle, the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. God is in their midst, and so because God is in their midst, they need to keep things clean. They need to keep things free of impurities, because God's nature is incompatible with the brokenness and the fallenness of the world. And disease is a manifestation of the fall, right? Prior to Adam and Eve's sin, there is no disease in the world. So infectious disease is a manifestation of sin, and therefore has to be dealt with, because this is the community of the people of God. What else? Anybody got anything?
Cities of refuge.
Cities of refuge, okay? So somebody who accidentally kills somebody else can go and take refuge in that city so that they're not just killed by the deceased person's family, where they're taking vengeance on this person. So this is a reminder to them. It's a law that regulates. It serves a function and a reminder of making sure that justice prevails. God is a God of justice. And he is the one who determines when lives are supposed to be taken. And you don't deserve the death penalty if the death is accidental, if you cause someone's death accidentally. And so this ensures that justice is the mark of the community of the people of God. We could go on. We've talked about food laws, right? We've talked about clothing. We've talked about, worship and all this. We've talked about, or we haven't talked about, but there's things like don't glean to the edges of the field. Leave some for the poor, because there's the desire to care for the poor, that the community of the people of God is supposed to be different. It's supposed to be marked by justice. It's supposed to be marked by compassion. And people are supposed to care for one another in that way. I do an exercise with my students where we talk about a day in the life of Boaz. You remember Boaz from the book of Ruth. It's Ruth's husband, and he is an Israelite. He's an elder, one of the town elders. And we go through and we talk about, Boaz gets up in the morning, and how does Torah affect him? And so, as he gets dressed, he has to get dressed as an Israelite. He goes down to breakfast. He has to eat as an Israelite. He goes out to the field. He has to farm as an Israelite. He has to, how he treats his animals, his livestock. He does that as an Israelite. He goes to do his job as an elder in the town gate. He does that as an Israelite, influenced by Torah. When he goes to bed, he recites the Shema. He does that as an Israelite. So what Torah does for Boaz and for all Israelites is it provides this constant reminder of who they are. So that if they're faithful, if they're obedient to this, they will always be reminded. There can never be a moment where they don't remember that they are Israelites, which goes along with what I said about the fact that every moment of every day is an opportunity to show loyalty to God or disloyalty. That takes us back to the supremacy of Yahweh, that idea, that has to be lived out. Remember, this whole idea of the religious significance of life is living out the supremacy of Yahweh, is highlighting the fact that God is supreme. And they have to live that out. Yes?
So I have a question.
Absolutely.
You said there were 613 commands in the law.
Yep.
So were those the original law, or was the laws less? And as we know as humans, we add laws and make them different as the years go on.
Yep.
So
That's the written law. That's the written Torah. Then there's the oral commands that get added to it and things like that. I'm only talking about the written commands. There's 613 written commands. Okay? Okay, so let's wrap up our time by talking about how this relates to us today. How does this relate to us today? We want to come out of the wilderness. We've talked about that. We've been in the wilderness for a couple of years in some respects. Maybe some of you have been in the wilderness for longer than that. But I want to suggest that this aspect of Deuteronomy's vision is also relevant for us today. All of life is religiously significant. Again, in quotes, because I'm not talking about religious as opposed to spiritual. But there's nothing in the New Testament, there's nothing in Jesus' life and ministry that would suggest that he only cares about what we do on Sunday mornings, on Wednesday nights, and the occasional retreat. All of life matters to God. All of life is under the lordship of Christ. And as such, how we live our lives matters. And this, I would suggest, is an important aspect of coming out of the wilderness, because part of the problem I think that we have in our contemporary society today is a disconnect from God. we feel disconnected. God's not really concerned about this aspect of my life, or he doesn't know what I'm doing. According to the Old Testament, he cares about what we wear. Okay? Now, not in a legalistic sense. I want to be clear on that. Not in the sense of a checklist that says, well, you're bad if you do that. But God gives instruction as to what the people are supposed to wear. Everything from big things to little things, God cares about. And again, there's nothing in the New Testament that would say that now Jesus says, don't worry about that. All I care about is those few times. The rest of the time is up to you. That, I think, is a recipe for disaster in some respects in the Christian life, is if we adopt the mindset that says, this set of things are the things God cares about. This set of things are mine. And I can be in charge of this set of things over here. Don't really have to worry about what God says over there. He's only concerned about this. That is a problem because it's not true. From a biblical perspective, God cares about every aspect of our lives. And that's as true for us today as it was for Moses' audience. And yet we tend not to live that way. So what does that mean? It means, I think, that we have to be thinking about living our lives as followers of Jesus. I said before that from an Old Testament perspective, every moment of every day is an opportunity to show loyalty to God or disloyalty to God. Nothing is different for us today. I would challenge us, here's another piece of homework maybe for this. This is a lot harder than the last one that I said. But I would challenge us to pray this week about that. Ask God to help you to see every moment of every day as an opportunity to show loyalty to God, and to be convicted when you aren't thinking of it that way. That's a huge thing to do, and yet that's what God calls us, what God calls his people to do. There's no such thing as part-time Christians. There's no such thing as half-time followers of Jesus. It's all, everything is supposed to be for him. The other thing that I would suggest is that we can take from this is that if all of life is religiously significant, one of the things we note is that the law gives a whole lot of instructions as to what are some practical ways to live those things out, these ritual kinds of things. Now, as Baptists, I know that makes us uncomfortable sometimes, with this idea of ritual. That's Catholic or whatever. We don't want to do that. And yet, the Old Testament is full of these kinds of things. In fact, the passage that I mentioned in Acts 10, where it says that Peter went up on the roof to pray, it's recognized that in the first century, there were fixed times of prayer for the Jews. They had 3 times a day when they would pray. Now, we think of that with Muslims, right? 5 times a day, Muslims stop whatever they're doing and pray. But Jews were doing that long before there was Islam. And yet that was a ritual that they were living out even after Jesus. And so there can be rituals that can be helpful. And I'm not suggesting that we adopt the rituals of the Torah. That's for a certain society and a certain rhythm to the society. But what I would encourage you to do is to think about, are there rituals that you can incorporate into your life that will similarly remind you and ground you in this, so that it's not just, well, I got to remember all the time that I'm a follower of Jesus. Well, how are you going to do that? You're not going to remember on your own. I mean, I respect all of you, but nobody is that perfect in their ability to do that. Here's an example. One of the things that I do as a ritual sort of thing, I know it's a little bit silly, but I get out of bed every morning, and I get out of bed in such a way that my knees are the first thing that touches the floor. And I don't stand up, I get down on my knees, and the first thing that I do is I pray. And I commit the day to God. But I haven't been on my feet at all, because to me, that's a symbol. It's an object lesson. It's a reminder to me that if I stand first, I'm suggesting that I can stand on my own, that I can do things by myself. I put my knees on the floor very first thing to remind myself that I need Jesus at every moment of my day. So that's just a little thing. Maybe it's silly. I'm not saying you have to do that, but I'd encourage you to think about ways that you can build in reminders into your day, into your week. You know, the sacred calendar that we find in the Torah is not accidental. The idea that there's a day of rest, the idea that there are holidays that are observed. It's all about reminding the people of who they are and being able to, because of that, to live more faithfully. Questions or comments that you'd like to make? How are we doing time-wise? Yep. All right, we've got 5 minutes. Anybody, questions or comments? Yes?
Why don't we follow the rules of the Torah more closely?
The question was, why don't we follow the rules of the Torah more closely? Well, some of the rules we don't follow because Jesus transforms our relationship to the Torah. Because as I mentioned, he comes along and changes things. What he does is he redefines the people of God around himself, so that, as I mentioned, when an Israelite is living in a certain way as a witness to the Gentiles, if a Gentile wants to come in, I mentioned Ruth before, right? She's a Moabite. She's not an ethnic Israelite. If she wants to come into the community of the people of God, she has to become functionally Israelite. She has to start doing the things that Boaz does, her husband and her family. When Jesus comes along, he redefines the people of God around himself in such a way that he says, if you want to be a part of the community of people of God, you identify with me, not with Israel. Because he is the fulfillment of many of the things that people needed from Israel. He's the fulfillment of the sacrificial system, for example. So we don't do sacrifice from the Torah because Jesus is the fulfillment of that. But it's important to note Christianity is a sacrificial religion. That hasn't changed. There's still the need for the shedding of blood in order to provide atonement for sin. It's just that Jesus does it once for all. Because Jesus redefines the people of God around himself, the important distinction between human beings is not Jew and Gentile, which is what the food laws were pointing to, as I mentioned, but rather it's followers of Jesus versus non-followers of Jesus. That's the crucial distinction today. And so some of the laws that point to that kind of distinction between Jew and Gentile, there are object lessons that point to a reality that doesn't exist anymore. And that's why we don't have to follow them. But I would suggest that many of the laws we should be following. Now we're going to do it differently from how the Israelites did it. And we should follow them not as a matter of earning relationship with God or earning favor with God, but in gratitude to what God has done for us. And he's given us instruction as to how to live. So, for example, God gives a day of rest to his people. Of course, you asked the question about the oral tradition. The oral tradition around Sabbath laws became quite extensive, but that's just the oral tradition. And Jesus, as he relates to that, is not advocating that oral tradition. But in my estimation, we need to be thinking about and receiving the gift that God has given to his people of a day of rest. And because that's something that he says is valuable. That's something that he gives to his people as a gift. And it's almost like he knows what he's doing when he says we need to have these breaks and rest from work, things like that. So we need to be receiving that and doing that. The problem is, because Jesus has fulfilled some aspects of the law, which, by the way, fulfill doesn't mean abolish either. It means to bring to fruition or to fill out aspects of that. But because of that, we think we don't have to pay attention to any of it or very little of it. And I think that's a mistake. So I think there's lots of things that we can do. We can ask ourselves the question, okay, why was this law given to the Israelites? And then ask ourselves the question, in light of Jesus and his ministry, how is this relevant for us today? That's a hugely different question from, is this law relevant for us today? And the assumption being that much of it is not. If we ask the question, how is this law relevant? It's going to be different, perhaps, but nevertheless, we begin to be able to avail ourselves of the guidance that God gives, the instruction that he gives on how to live a life that's pleasing to God. And we can do that without the legalistic aspect of it. I'm not advocating, and the Old Testament is not advocating a legalistic approach to this, that this is all about earning favor with God or salvation. Yep.
So I'm thinking, as you're talking about all of this, I'm thinking, okay, the world that we live in, that we're going out into each and every day, their perception of the credibility of all this hinges so much on what Teresa asked. Why don't we follow the law as it's written? And our ability to sort of translate that like you just did, how I'm just processing how we can think about this in an articulate manner that doesn't sound like, well, you can just pick and choose whichever ones you like and go with those.
Right.
To people who want to understand the credibility of our faith and find it difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the biggest obstacles to non-Christians becoming Christians is not Christianity, it's Christians. It's our inability to be consistent in our life and our profession and our life, our faith and our witness. That's a huge problem. I mean, we are the biggest obstacles to people coming to faith in Christ. And so by conceiving of Torah in this way, by the way, the better translation of Torah instead of law is instruction. To conceive of it as simply instructions that God gives, not law that all of a sudden you're a bad person if you don't do something that it says, but it's instruction. And if we can conceive of ways of living out our faith so that we demonstrate that all of life matters to God, if that's true, then we should live that way. And so we have the task of saying, well, how do we live that all of life matters to God? Well, thankfully, God's already given us some instructions on this. We don't have to start from scratch. We could, but I'm not sure we're going to do better than what he's already given. So I think that's right, Tracy, that the more we can be consistent in our witness, the better we're going to be at truly being witnesses to people around us who are skeptical of that. I mean, we all know how people respond when they say, you Christians are this, and then they point to, fill in the blank, what pastor has fallen in some way, or you Christians do this, and then you say this, but then you all do that. Now, is it all fair? No, of course not. And you can't paint with that broad a brush, but there's enough truth in it that makes it problematic for us. So the more we can be living the way God calls us to, the better we're able to say, this is who we are, and this is what it means to follow, and this is the credibility of our faith. All right, I think our time is up. Oops, we're over time. So thanks for your work today. We'll see you next week.